If you want to say hi to Drew, just say hi, Drew. I don't know where he is, but he's enjoying himself somewhere, I'm sure. He's on vacation with his family. So, sorry, it's me today. So when I first heard that we were going to do this series, and I'll just refer to it as No Regrets because it makes my head hurt, I thought, like, Drew, that ship has sailed. No regrets? Are you kidding me? I'm like looking at 60 this summer, and I've got some regrets. And then when I got the email that said, hey, you want to speak on one of the Sundays that we're doing No Regrets? I was like, no, I really don't. He said, well, I think you can, and I think you should, and here I am. So here we're going to talk about making decisions so we have fewer regrets in our lives. And the main point today that we're going to talk about is that the legacy you want to leave determines the decisions you want to make. This life of no regrets really comes down to the decisions we make day to day. And obviously, there's not an adult in this room who hasn't made a decision or two that they've regretted. There's nobody here that doesn't live with the pain of a bad decision or the hurt of regret. But here's the thing. You can't stay in that pain and in that regret forever. I think you should stay in it long enough to learn the lesson that needed to be learned, because there's always lessons to learn out of our mistakes. That's why God redeems us. But don't let the paralysis of regret or dumb decisions make you ineffective for the kingdom and for your legacy. Don't stay in regret. Move on and move forward. And we're going to talk about that at some length today. Because the truth is, we write the story of our lives one decision at a time. Whether it's some very thoughtful response we've considered, or whether it's just a super emotional reaction that we have, we write the story of our lives one decision at a time. So here is tip number one. I hope this is like a super practical thing, and you don't feel like, oh gosh, regret. I'll never overcome regret. I want this to be super, super practical for all of us today, because we all have, this is a day-to-day thing. So tip number one is this. Anytime you're making a decision of any magnitude or of any consequence, here's what you should do. You should pause and ask this question. What story do I want to tell? Think about it this way. What story do I want to tell? When this decision or this business transaction or this season of life is just a story I'm telling somebody, what story do I want to tell? Do you want to be the hero of your story, or do you want to be the villain? Do you want to be the bad example, or do you want to be the good example? Which option is going to make this story a story that you want to tell your children and your grandchildren, and not make it a story that you hope nobody ever finds out about, and certainly nobody ever tells anybody else about? You get to decide, because as far as it is up to you, you write the story of your life one decision at a time. And every decision you make becomes a permanent part of your story, the story of your life. That's why when you're making a decision of any magnitude, stop, look ahead, and think, when this is nothing more than a story I'm telling, what's the story I want to tell? I think one of the reasons that we don't always get to that question about story is because we make decisions many times in heat of a moment or out of emotion. Dang emotions, right? God gave us emotions, but me, have trouble getting a handle on them sometimes, right? In the heat of the moment, the pressure of decision making, it's like a fog. Were any of you driving through the fog the other morning? That was no joke. That was bad fog the other morning. And emotion tends to make our decision making like that fog. We only see right here, and we lose context for everything else that's out here. Isn't that what fog does? That's emotion when it comes to our decision making. You're up against a deadline, you got to decide, and you got to decide soon. Marry me or I'm leaving. Well, nobody wants to be left. Up your job production or you're fired. Well, nobody wants to be fired. So when you're forced to make a decision under pressure, it's hard to think about tomorrow because you're just trying to get through today. Isn't that true? I was talking to somebody kind of unrelated about my children, and I attribute the success of my children to the prayers of my parents. And for some reason, I think it's because grandparents have the ability to pray in the long term. Parents, and I was a single mom for any number of years, are praying in the immediate. Just let them have a good day at school today. Please don't let that come. And it's not wrong, it's just incomplete. But grandparents just have this ability to think through the end of the story, where sometimes we can't see past that. When we're so involved in the weeds and the day-to-day of making decisions and trying to do the right thing for our children. So whether it's out of fear or jealousy or pick an emotion, the emotions associated with decision-making process always complicate it because we lose sight of the ultimate. And there are no emotionally neutral decision-making situations, are there? When it comes to big decisions, it's almost impossible to be objective because of our emotions. This is why your worst decision, and I don't know all of you personally, but I'm taking a stab here that your worst decision was fueled by something with strong emotional appeal, right? That purchase, that lease. There was something so appealing about that you ate it, or you drank it, or you smoked it. There was something so appealing about that person that you fell in love and you moved in with it, right? There was something so appealing and so sparkly, I bought it. I mean, you bought it, right? Man, our emotions get the best of it. So here's best of us. Tip number 2. When you're confronted with anything with strong emotional appeal, which is a whole lot of things, press pause, not play. Because strong emotional appeal should trigger a red flag for us, not a green light. Not because he's not the right one, he might be the right one. Not because it's not a good investment, it might be a really good investment. Not because it's not the job for you, it might be the job for you. But strong emotional appeal, even if it's the right thing standing in front of us, clouds our ability to make a sound decision. So just hit pause, go home, call a friend who loves you and you trust, pray about it, and consider your story. How is this decision going to affect your story? Because when you consider your story, the decision-making process falls within the broader context of our entire lives, lift the fog of emotion, just like you wish the fog would go away when you're driving. Get rid of the emotion, get rid of that fog. Stop, pause, consider, pray, talk to a friend, and then move forward. Now, the Old Testament story of Joseph is a great story and a great reminder of how powerful and legacy-preserving good decision-making is. Now, many of you know the story, and you could probably tell it yourself. So we're going to go through the story at breakneck speed and kind of the Cliff Notes version, all right? So in around 1800 BC, a 17-year-old boy named Joseph, the 11th of 12 sons, finds himself in a no-win situation that is not of his own making. We're going to come back to that thought. He finds himself in a situation not of his own making. His father, Jacob, loved him more than he loved his other boys because Joseph was the son of his favorite wife. There might be a problem, but the other boys knew that, and it fueled the fires of jealousy within his older brothers. Eventually, as you probably know, the brothers decide that they are going to get rid of this problem-favored child, and they're going to kill him. Okay, that's a great decision. No emotion tied to that. They decide to kill him, but in the end, when it comes right down to it, they lose their nerve. They can't do it, so they decide to beat him up and trade him off to slave traders instead. Okay, it was a little kinder than killing him and definitely more profitable to them. So they sell their brother to slave traders, and off Joseph goes to Egypt. Then the brothers go home, and they tell their father that his favorite son was just killed by a wild animal. Think about that. Now, these 10 young men have just created a situation for themselves, many situations for themselves, where they're going to have to be liars for the rest of their lives. They have told a lie to their father to save their own necks. There's no recouping from. Don't make decisions that make you a liar for the rest of your life. So they have a chapter now in their lives that's not really a great story. It's not a story they want to tell. This is the story. We were so jealous of our younger brother that the 9 of us got together and beat the tar out of him and sold him off to slave traders, and he went to Egypt. That's not a great story. And then we lied to my father, and we told him that his favorite son was dead, and that's not a good story either. So the brothers have put themselves in a situation by their decision where they are now liars for life. It's not a story you want to tell. So finally, Joseph ends up on an auction block in Egypt, and he is purchased there by a military officer named Potiphar. And now Joseph has a decision to make. Am I going to run? Am I going to try to get out of this? Am I going to be a horrible slave? What am I going to do? Everybody else was trying to run. Or he had another decision. He says, am I going to enter into this slave situation I now find myself in, not of my own making, and give it everything I've got? I'm going to be the best slave there ever was. Because he could have gone either way. It's an interesting dilemma for a rich kid who was beat up and sold by his brothers. Now, here's what part of the story makes this relatable. Joseph found himself, and we haven't hit all of them yet. We've hit a few of them. Time after time after time after time in his life, found himself in horrible situations that were not of his own making. Sometimes we make our own sad, sorry bed, and then we have to lie in it. But sometimes other people enter our lives and put us in these no-win situations that just land us in a really bad place. Joseph's story like parts of your story, was commandeered by selfish, bad people. So why even try? Joseph was doing the right things. He was making good decisions. Bad people got into his life and just kind of train wrecked it. Why would you not throw up your hands and say, why bother? I think that's the temptation for a lot of us, right? We're trying to do the right thing. It doesn't seem to come back and bless us immediately, and we got these crazy people in our lives who are writing a bad story for us. So why even try? But somehow, some way, Joseph resisted that temptation to just throw up his hands and give up and say, I don't deserve this. I didn't bring it on myself. I didn't do anything wrong. I'm going to put my head down, stay under the radar, do as little as I can, and try not to garner any attention from anybody else. That would have been an understandable reaction, wouldn't it? You know, I think I might have said that once or twice in my life. I'm just going to stay low and do my job and blah, 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 blah. Woe is me. But he didn't do that. Somehow, somewhere, Joseph draws on the resources where he makes a decision to serve Potiphar's household as if it were his own. He does a wonderful job. He's gracious, he's kind, and eventually Potiphar notices and he gives Joseph even more responsibility, and Joseph ends up in charge of the whole household, Potiphar's whole household. And if you think of it, that's a story worth telling, right? I was kidnapped once. I was sold twice, Joseph's story. I was a victim, but I decided not to act like a victim. I was not going to live my life as a victim. That was the story that Joseph decided. That's the story Joseph was in the process of writing when along comes another bad person intersecting with Joseph's life. And that person was Potiphar's wife, who insisted that Joseph become her lover. I'm thinking this woman was probably not an unattractive woman. This was a powerful woman. But what was Joseph going to do? It's at this juncture in Joseph's story that he just does something that is very, very smart, very, very powerful, very, very helpful. He out loud articulates the story of his wife in response to Potiphar's wife. This is how we know he made his decision within the context of his life story. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to kind of paraphrase some of the conversation that went on between Joseph and Potiphar's wife, and then I'm going to finish it by actually reading the text as the Bible lays it out for us. So Potiphar's wife has propositioned Joseph, and Joseph now has a decision to make. And he says, Mrs. Potiphar, I came to this land as a slave. I had no rights, and I had no opportunity, no future. Your husband purchased me, and I did my best to serve him and you. And with God's help, I've gained the trust of your husband. He's put me in charge of this entire household. My story is getting pretty good. And then he says this, and this I quote out of the book of Genesis. He said, with me in charge of the household, he told her, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns, he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. What do you think happens after this great little speech from Joseph? He's given me everything but you because you are his wife. Mrs. Potiphar, think about your story. Do you really want an affair with a Hebrew slave to be part of your story? Do you really want that part of your story to be something you tell your children and your grandchildren? Then Joseph steps back and says, in light of of everything that's just happened, in light of the kindness of your husband, in light of all the good things that he's done for me, and in light of God's mercy on me, who's watched over me and protected me in situations that everybody else just kind of might have given up on, how then, in light of all that, could I do such a horrible, wicked thing and have an affair with you? Why would I want to add adultery to what's turning out to be a pretty good story? I only have two options, Mrs. Potiphar, and this is what they are. I have the story of your husband buying me. He gave me an opportunity I never dreamed would come my way. I was faithful to him. And God, who's been watching over me and has been looking out for me, has taken good care of me, and my story's getting pretty good. Or the other option I have, Mrs. Potiphar, is deciding this story. Your husband gave me an opportunity I never dreamed possible. So I took advantage of his trust and had an affair with his wife. Which story do I want to decide for myself? Which story do I want to tell? Which story do you want to tell when the decision that you're in the middle of making right now is nothing more than the story you tell? Right now it seems overwhelming. Right now it seems crushing, perhaps on every side. You don't know what to do. But at some point in your life, it's going to be a story you tell. What story do you want to tell about this chapter in your life? Because the legacy you want to leave determines the decisions you want to make. Now, as you probably know, Joseph decided the better of those two options, and he ran from Potiphar's wife's presence. He did not give in to that particular temptation, but it didn't turn out, once again, so good for Joseph. He did the right thing. He said no. He ran out of there, and Potiphar's wife accuses him of rape. And this lands Joseph into Pharaoh's dungeon. But Joseph's story isn't over, and your story isn't over, and my story isn't over. It's true when we find ourselves in a long, difficult chapter, in a long, difficult decision-making process. It feels like this chapter is our entire story. And I can think back a couple different times in my life, right now, at the drop of a hat, and think when a dark chapter felt like it was my whole story. It's not true. God gave me breath for another day. His mercies are new every morning. Your story isn't over, no matter how dark the chapter seems. You keep going. Because it's our responses to the situations we face, and it's the decisions we make in those difficult chapters, they make all the difference between the story you want to tell and a story you hope nobody ever finds out. So now Joseph is in the dungeon after doing nothing wrong. He's in the dungeon, and Joseph does the same thing Joseph has always done. He makes good decisions. And after several years, don't let that get past you, after several years of being in a dungeon, he earns the trust of the prison guard. Now, it's nobody's life ambition to earn the trust of a prison guard, I don't think, right? It's like a pretty low bar. Yeah, well, the prison guard trusts me. Well, good for you. But Joseph did the best thing he could do with where he was and what he had. And so before long, the prison guard places a lot of trust in Joseph, and he gives him a lot more responsibility. And pretty soon, Joseph's like the inmate in charge of the inmates, right? He has a lot of leeway and a lot of responsibility given to him. And this comes to the king's attention because the king one night had a dream that he thought had significance for Egypt and for the lands beyond. He thought it was an important dream, and none of his magicians or interpreters could figure out what this dream meant. So the prison guard says, hey, they got this guy named Joseph. He might be able to help you out. So Joseph goes to the throne room, straight out of the dungeon, and Joseph says to the king, hey, I hear you've had this dream. I can't interpret this dream for you either. But the God I love, the God I serve, certainly can. And Joseph proceeds to interpret the dream for Pharaoh. And the dream meant that Egypt would experience 7 years of great prosperity, great flourishing. They would have more food than they knew what to do with. They would have all kinds of grain. It was just going to be a wonderful 7 years. But at the end of that 7 years, there was going to be 7 years of famine. And everybody's personal storage of grain and food and resources was going to be gone. It would be a terrible, terrible 7 years. So when Joseph finished interpreting the dream, everybody in the throne room, thought he'd be escorted back down to the dungeon and off he would go. But Joseph did something that was pretty unthinkable at the time, and Joseph offered the Pharaoh unsolicited advice. Hebrew slave prisoner that he was, telling the Pharaoh what to do. So what the advice that he gave the Pharaoh was this. He said, Pharaoh, somebody needs to wake up every single morning focused on this problem, focused on the grain storage problem, because you're going to have lots for 7 years, and then for 7 years are going to be nothing. So find somebody you trust, put them in charge, and let them handle this situation for you. So everybody in the throne room were like, oh, Lordy, what's going to happen? He just gave the Pharaoh unsolicited advice. Nobody ever does that, and he's a slave. And so the Pharaoh, in response, smiles, and he says to the people standing around, can we find anyone like this man in whom is the Spirit of God? This is a pagan king, mind you. Can we find anyone like this man in whom is the Spirit of God? And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, God has made this all known to you, and no one is as discerning and wise as you are. You are going to be in charge of my palace, and you're going to be in charge of the grain silos, and you're going to be in charge of the people. Everybody's going to do what you tell them to do, and only with respect to the throne, meaning Pharaoh himself, would anyone be greater than you. And at that moment, Pharaoh makes Joseph prime minister of the entire land of Egypt. He had just come out of a dungeon. Is the irony of that not like prisoner, prime minister? That's almost laughable with some of our politics going on, but not really. Okay. Okay. Once again, Joseph did what Joseph does, and he made good decisions. He devotes himself to this unprecedented opportunity of managing the grain in the silos for the next 7 years. 7 years later, as he predicted, famine hits, and Egypt is in crisis. But thanks to Joseph's great management, there's enough Pharaoh silos of grain. Everybody is eating and fed and all that. And even people from neighboring countries are coming around because the famine has spread beyond Egypt. And as these people from neighboring countries come around for some grain, guess who comes along? Joseph's brothers. Interesting dilemma, right? So, of course, Joseph recognizes them right away, but they don't recognize Joseph. It's been probably about 17, 18 years since they've seen him. And if you've never read the story, read it. Lots of details we can't do now. But eventually, Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, tells them who he is. And the brothers are terrified and beg for mercy, which they don't think they're going to get. But Joseph extends grace and forgiveness. There's a gap in this story. I want to see the conversation with Jacob and those 9 boys. You told me he was dead. That was an interesting conversation, I bet, right? Okay. So Joseph ultimately gives them forgiveness. And here's the point of the story. Joseph was not like his brothers. Why wasn't he like his brothers? Because at some point long, long ago, Joseph decided he was not going to throw up his hands and give up. He was not going to let fate decide the outcome of his story. Joseph was going to decide a better story for himself. Sometimes you're dealt hoopy cards, right? Sometimes it's not fair, the things that happen to you. Sometimes things are thrust upon you that are not of your own making, and you want to give up. Don't give up. Look at the story of Joseph. He takes what's handed to him. He continues to have faith in the God he knows loves him and is going to redeem the situation, and he does the best that he can. He decides well. He makes decisions that make his story better, that make his story one that he was willing to tell his children and his grandchildren. He decided a story worth telling, and that's why we're telling his story. So in addition to saving Egypt, he rescues his entire family and their families, moves them to Egypt, and now he's got a magnificent story. A story he chose, a story he decided, one decision, one response at a time. Which brings me back to us, to you, to me. What story do you want to tell? What story do you want told about you? Like Joseph and like his brothers, you're writing the story of your life one decision at a time. I have a sign hanging in my office that was inspired by somebody that attends here, and it says, "Win the moment." I don't win every moment, I have to tell you. But if you just win the moment, one decision at a time, one moment at a time, God, give me the grace and the wisdom and the strength to do the right thing in this moment. And your life is built upon moment after moment after moment, decision after decision after decision. If you haven't decided a good story for yourself up to this point, remember this. This is just the current chapter, not the whole story. It's a chapter. It's not the end. You have the opportunity when you wake up tomorrow morning to start brand new. That's what grace is for. That's the God we love. That's the Redeemer we serve. I want to challenge you to make a decision right now. You have an opportunity to practice. This is your first practice in decision making. I want to challenge you to make this decision. I'll decide a story I'll be proud to tell. Every time you're faced with a decision of any magnitude, ask yourself, when this is nothing more than a story I tell, what story do I want to tell? And then decide accordingly, because you write the story of your life one decision at a time. So write a good one. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for this story of Joseph, who could have easily just thrown his hands up and said, I give up. I've been doing right things after right things after right things. I'm making good decisions, and I am in a dungeon. Wow. But you never lost sight of Joseph. You never stopped loving him. And it's the same for us. Give us the strength, the courage, the wisdom to choose well, to decide well, to win moments. Let's string a whole lifetime of moments together. Give us the grace to do that. We love you. In your name, amen.